Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming and thank you for having us here at the conference. As Professor already mentioned, between May and July 2016, I spent 10 weeks working in Quito with Ecuadorian Center for Promotion and Action of Women, or in short, CEPAM, with whom we still collaborate. Working predominantly with women from low-income backgrounds and their families, offers social, psychological, or legal assistance to everyone who is going through a process of reporting gender-based violence or who have a wish to start a process and learn more about how to do it. One day, I sat through a several-hour meeting with Ecuadorian feminists who work in different areas of violence. A debate started heating up when they began discussing a 4-year plan involving strategies for institutions to approach gender-based violence in Ecuador. One of their proposals was to develop a model that typifies separate forms of violence in order to know what type of service would best serve each. While some immediately disagreed, explaining that violence is too complex, others suggested that men should be added to the matrix of violence because they, as the most common aggressors, don't receive sufficient attention. Men? While a few women in the room exchanged looks, one of them sharply opposed it, saying, "They aren't the focus. You all can read a study about masculinities in Ecuador to learn about that. We have been in this fight for too long and achieved too little to take up another fight that would draw attention to the systemic obstacles that prevent them from participating in the struggle." Ecuador, according to many studies, is considered one of the more progressive countries in Latin America in the sense that it has brought violence into focus through decade-long efforts to pass legislation and reform institutions. All of these laid the foundation for advancement in the field of women's rights, gender equity, and efforts to ensure a violence-free life. Yet, violence remains a perpetual problem. The title of my presentation is a quote from one of my research participants and suggests that it is not only men who abuse women, it is also the system that has been working towards eradication of violence since the early 70s. Drawing on ethnographic work, individual narratives, and a critical analysis of 380 case files that keep records of CEPAM users, I will use today's opportunity to highlight some of the ways through which the system has imagined the reparations of violence and, in the eyes of those who experience it, failed. I will also talk about some of the reasons why a set of alternatives to addressing gender-based violence in Ecuador that I propose suggests not only expanding the framework of violence, but also to include those that have been intentionally left out of it, men, who are the most common aggressors. Theoretically, this work is inspired by the scholars who argued that violence is socially constructed and, as put eloquently by Sally Mary Engel, quote, rooted in structural conditions such as political economy, globalization, the expansion of capitalism, and the growing inequality between rich and poor nations, as well as in the dynamics of interpersonal relationships. End of quote. For the purpose of this study, I limit discussion to intimate partner violence, where intimate partner is a legal, cohabiting, or sexual partner, and where the relationship is embedded within the institutions of family, household units, gender system, power relations, and ideology. Okay. In 2011, the Ecuadorian Statistical Institute launched an intersectional nationwide survey that encompassed almost 19,000 households about gender-based violence, which was defined as violence against women. It aimed to eliminate all forms of violence in all spheres and determine the magnitude with respect to sociocultural and economic factors on the national, regional, and provincial level. Each woman over the age of 15 who participated in the study was given a set of short definitions of physical, psychological, sexual, and patrimonial violence, which is a type of violence that regards violation of women's property rights, sometimes used interchangeably with economic violence that, as studied by Carmen Diana Deer, tends to highlight acts that restrict women's ability to generate or control their own income or support their family. The results revealed that 6 out of every 10 Ecuadorian women has been a victim of one of these forms of violence, which was a line that is widely circulated across the country in the media, which obscures socio-cultural and ethnical nuances in this incredibly diverse country. The translation of violence into numerical data informed public and contributed to the 2014 reform of the Ecuadorian legislation that brought several reforms in the area of gender-based violence, criminalizing strictly defined forms of physical, psychological, and sexual violence, The new code redefines the rules of the process of reporting. Two reforms showed the most inconsistencies between theory and practice. First is the exclusion of economic or patrimonial violence, which are very prevalent in Latin America and also amongst the CIPAM users that I talked to, whose narratives were filled with stories of losing houses during or after divorce, fighting for inheritance, or having their assets taken away or manipulated with. Second, this new code also placed a huge emphasis on the so-called certificates that need to be obtained by those undergoing the abuse and presented to the judge who examines them. Part of this material evidence is produced by CIPAM, but I'll return to that in a second. Words of my 25-year-old participant speak for itself. She says, "I have everything. The bruises on my body, on my back, on my arm. I have bruises on my face. I have pain in my heart. But I also have lots and lots of calls and messages from him that I kept. Now I will have a report from my psychologist, from CIPAM, which will add to the medical report I already have. I will get my justice after I get my evidence." End of quote. This systemic change, the reform of legislation, came in package with the governmental reforms implemented by the current president, who promised that the 21st century socialist revolution that he will start will have a woman's face. This paradigm has received mixed reviews, and as discussed by Amy Lind, even in the areas of gender-based violence, quote, "Centrality of heteronormative social reproduction in shaping the contours of the debates and the futures of post-neoliberal remained," end quote. Following the so-called socialist paradigm, a coalition of women launched an extensive media campaign called React Ecuador, The Machismo is Violence, that aimed to raise awareness of the presence of machismo, a characteristic roughly defined as referring to a broader constellation of male behaviors, especially entitlement to authority, womanizing, and ideas about honor and shame. Aiming to foreground the ways in which machismo is materialized in society, the campaign utilized highly stereotypical symbols, including those that are widely recognized as feminine. For example, a purse set over by a man's foot, a white sheet that emphasizes the private nature of sexual violence, or exaggerated images such as presenting a machista man in a manner that would be considered primitive, dressed in like Neanderthal clothes. These TV commercials excluded LGBT participants and those who would fall into categories of Ecuadorian, indigenous, or any other category, ethnical categories that are not mestizos, which is the most, a category most commonly identified with. And presenting women not as active agents, but as actors who send more and less transparent messages in which men are considered to be those who should act upon stopping the violence from happening and no longer ignore it, which was also one of the slogans. Now that I've outlined these multi-scales initiatives, let's look at the role that CIPAM has in this. CIPAM's team occupies a strategic position between those people who seek their assistance and the authorities who determine the destiny of the reporting process. They play a vital role in transmitting messages, deconstructing as well as contributing to the dominating narratives that present a matrix of violence as constructed within the forms of sexual, psychological, physical, and sometimes economic violence, not legally. As the complex meanings and experiences of violence shift and intertwine among the users, CIPAM pays close attention to the factors, spending as much time as needed for the person to work through their experience. However, they must meet an institutional requirement imposed by the Ministry of Justice that makes CIPAM eligible for financial support that contributes to the strength of their services and eradication of gender-based violence in Ecuador, which involves standardized forms that the team needs to fill out upon every person's first visit. So these standardized forms translate the distinctive living experiences of people who come to CIPAM into a much more limited categories that are provided on those forms that are generated by the normative discourse in Ecuador. These are the psychological, physical, sexual, and patrimonial. In some ways, these forms prevent the flexible meanings of violence to travel outside of CIPAM circles and inform public about the more complex meanings of violence than those constructed by the National Survey and other campaigns and the laws. One category of people, however, who I argue would need to be represented even more are men. On one Friday afternoon, a few members of CIPAM team and I conducted a very dynamic workshop in the old part of Quito with parents to discuss ways in which gender-based violence can be recognized and addressed. At some point, a few mothers began to talk to each other about the frustrations they face when their children get difficult. One of them explained that their partner solves the aggressions with more aggression. This sparked outrage from a man who could relate to the situation and the woman was talking about and said, quote, "Well, what can I do when she shouts? I get macho. I don't know any other way to protect myself in this situation," end of quote. Women reacted strongly, saying that he doesn't do anything, which was followed by a round of applause. The man stood up and defended himself, which encouraged another man in the room to contribute to the debate, asserting that yes, they do help around the house, but that, quote, "I work in construction and I'm extremely tired after a long day at work. Sometimes I just can't help that I get impatient," end of quote. While everyone was engaging, I heard two men sitting close to me agreeing that it is indeed very hard being a construction worker. Someone added fuel to the fire and said that working in construction is no harder than what women do around the house during the day. A group of mothers sitting next to me agreed with each other and said, "This is machismo, you know, in this society. We raise them and we have them." To which her friend responded, "It's as if I was listening to my husband and now he's the victim? No." The complexities of this event indicate the remarkable power of gender ideologies embedded not only in the socioeconomic system, but also in the practices of those that work against it. Considering the fact that the workshop was conducted with a population that is considered indigenous, from economically very disadvantaged backgrounds, this aligns especially well with Susan Paulson's argument about the processes and expectations through which, quote, "subordinate masculinities shape the horizons and experiences of men positioned as poor, rural, indigenous, or black," end of quote. While the two men who appeared to be in their 40s struggled to express their frustration, those who don't understand their hard work, the women struggled just as hard to articulate their side of the story. But they, as opposed to the men, had a network of support in the room that included the Sepang workers. So on the contrary to the belief of feminists that I mentioned at the beginning, who discuss the future of violence in Ecuador, men and masculinities are highly critical to understanding, as well as being incorporated into the policies around gender-based violence and actions in Ecuador. While scholars there have already recognized that, the messages sent to the public have not. Certain groups get recognized, but obscured in national campaigns, legislations that translate violence experiences into numerical categories, failing to represent dynamics that contribute to and reproduce their violent realities in Ecuador. They also fail to emphasize the intersections of different forms of violence that emerge in complex contexts, especially economic or patrimonial violence that intersects with other forms of violence, and contribute to the systemic abuse of women, which fails to provide enough information about the prevalence of these forms that are also not typified in the legislation. This legislation instead puts more focus on material evidence that needs to be presented, part of which is obtained at CEPAM, where women are sent for therapies upon presenting a report. Some victims who depend on the legal process to determine the course of the report perceive that authorities responsible for their destinies manipulate power in a strategic way, hand in hand with the material evidence that monitors the ways in which their corporeal and mental state transforms with the experience of gender-based violence. The standardized forms that are part of the case files play the main role in translating the experiences of CEPAM's users and sending them to the judges. My idea of addressing gender-based violence in Ecuador includes a call for a broader understanding of this framework that does not limit the experiences only to these forms of violence, that only foreground the intimacy of relationship within which the violence occurs, physical, psychological, sexual. It also looks beyond categorizing violence into mere neat categories that cannot be applied effectively to ethnically, racially, geographically such a diverse state, such as Ecuador. It also includes patrimonial economic violence that fits within the matrix of systemic violence perpetuated by the state that, in Foucauldian terms, represents another instrument of surveillance and control that enables monitoring the process of person's progress. Finally, I envision that different types of violence that is also gender-based, suffered by men, would also be recognized. They should not draw attention from women's concerns, but rather illuminate what Paulson calls, quote, hierarchical regimes of masculinity in which many actors struggle to become men and to demonstrate their manliness, end of quote. Thank you.